Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to the final session and also the final keynote in the two-day conference we are organizing called the Research and Knowledge in Art Practice. And we have had a wonderful two-day uh, series of sessions, very fruitful discussions and very engaging interactions, focusing on what is artistic research, and the diversity of artistic research, the diversity of knowledge production, and also decentering, questioning, critically interrogating certain conventional ideas and approaches and assumptions about what is artistic research and how could we define artistic research collectively and also move away apart from a bureaucratic policy level understanding of what artistic research is and what artistic practice is. Like all good things come to an end, that's what we say, but all critical endeavors must go on. So this conference is just the beginning. It's not the end, and we hope to continue the dialogue. We hope to generate more discussions about what artistic research is and what artistic knowledge is in the coming days. Today, for the final keynote session, we have with us the artist and educator, Dr. Felicity Allen. And I'll briefly introduce her. Felicity Allen is a British artist working alone and collaboratively. Her 2 year residency with the academic research project, People Like You, Contemporary Figures of Personalization, has produced the 6 series of Dialogic Portraits and the 12-minute film, Figure to Ground, a site losing its system. An illustrated discussion of the work is at the website called peoplelikeyou.ac.uk, alongside an illustrated interview in the academic anthology Figure, Concept and Method, edited by Celia Lurie, Scott Walk, published by Palgrave in 2022. Building on her concept of the Disoeuvre, which she will be talking today, which she originally explored through her doctorate, a series of prints and the Man Bibliothèque book, Disoeuvre, published in 2019, she is working with the Women's Art Library at the Goldsmiths to develop the idea with others. Their session at the 2022 Association of Art Historians Conference is titled Identifying the Disoeuvre, Artistic Labor Beyond the Oeuvre. Having led art education for Tate, she has written widely on gallery education, and her 2011 book, Education, published by MIT as part of the series called Documents of Contemporary Art, continues to be circulated. The lecture today is titled Circumventing Fixed Borders from Oeuvre to Disoeuvre. And I quickly talk to you about the abstract, which and I quote Dr. Felicity Allen here. People positioned as marginal to arts production have to work socially and institutionally, as well as in the studio, in order not only to make work, but to change the structures to allow their work to be recognized and critically received as, rather than disregarding those whose conventional oeuvre seems interrupted and inconsistent. We should look for artistic consistency in an artist's work made in and beyond the studio through employment at arts institutions connected, for instance, to the labor of care, activism, or other social practices. My neologism, the Disoeuvre, aims to elucidate the art careers of women of my generation as an exemplar for others who might identify quite differently. As a critical tool, the Disoeuvre takes account of artists' training in adaptability and their working life across different sites. It responds to practices encountering and persisting through feminized labor as maintenance or precarity, domestic instability, the transience of documentation, new recognition for overlooked visual activism and curatorial strategies, archival gaps, and is open to more. Considering the concept of the Disoeuvre, I will reflect on three areas of situated practice in my own career, taking account of implications for pedagogy, recently with the academic research project, People Like You, contemporary figures of personalization, and with the project Refugee Tales, with Syrian artists and young people in the 2000s as an employee at Britain and as an artist in residence at Durham Cathedral from 1984 to 85. I welcome you, Dr. Allen, and I invite you to present your keynote lecture. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Premjit, and thank you to Atul and everybody else for inviting me here today and for putting on such a tremendous conference. It's been a real pleasure, a frustrating pleasure at times because of connections, but it's been a real pleasure to listen and speak with you. Can you hear me okay?
It's perfect. It's good.
Yep.
Okay, good. I'm going to go straight to showing my slide show, I hope. Yeah, let's try that. Okay. Okay, so now let's see if I can even manage this. I don't want that one. I want that one. Okay, from start. There we are. Is that okay?
Yes, it's good.
Yes, great. Thank you. Okay. Thank you so much, and I'm so grateful to be part of this tremendous conference. I've struggled with this paper because there was so much I wanted to talk about, and I kept on finding more and more stuff that I thought was relevant. So, of course, what I've done is chopped loads out, and I may have chopped the wrong bits out. So I've written it, but I might every so often go off and improvise a bit. I'm particularly interested in thinking about questions, the use of the word desire that I think Atul uses, maybe you, Premjit, as well, in terms of how an artist might be motivated to make work rather than through research. And maybe that's something we can come back to. And also something that I just wanted to raise is that, of course, when I came up with the idea of the Disoeuvre, it was really through looking back at my own career, because as a woman of my generation, and I'm certainly not unique in this, my career has been quite choppy, going in and out of institutions, and I've taught in higher education, but then found myself running away for different reasons or going to trying another route. And although it's not necessarily easy, and it's certainly not enriching to do that economically, I think in lots of ways what it does do is allow one as an artist to have a sense of, okay, I'm going to do this, but I'm not going to do that. And I think for artists, that's a very important part of one's makeup, really. So I was asked to talk in relation to research within the ecosystem of contemporary art and art within an academic institution. And I want to discuss this in the context of three ideas. I've slightly simplified from the original abstract. First, the work of poet David Hurd and Refugee Tales. Second, the development of my concept of the Disoeuvre. And third, my current residency with the academic research project, People Like You, Contemporary Figures of Personalization. And I'll start by reading a poem by the British poet David Hurd. Fact. This is just to say, when a detainee from the Dover Immigration Removal Centre applies for bail, if he has a bail hearing, which he is not entitled to attend, though his lawyer is, and the judge is, and a representative of the Home Office is, the bail hearing, imagine, is officially unrecorded. There are three reasons why I'm sharing this poem with you. First, it vividly describes people representing British institutions actively complicit in denying people habeas corpus because they are indefinitely detained. As habeas corpus is a human right, these lawyers, judges, and officials are tacitly refuting human rights because necessarily human rights belong to all humans. The language of the poem notes, second reason, is the language of the poem notes the significance of recording and sharing information and exclusions from this. As sites of knowledge production, including through archival research, these two qualities have implications for academic institutions. Critically, though, for artists and writers, as well as for governance, it raises questions about representation, misrepresentation, and self-representation. In an article due to be published in an anthology by Parlour Press, David Hurd has connected this unrecording with silencing, the fact that most British people don't know that people are put in indefinite detention. He refers to Giorgio Agamben calling such a situation a state of exception, where the law was in force, but where it might not be appealed to. Legally, politically, out with the edge. End quote. David has written about his first encounter in 2009 with the building once called the Citadel, now called Dover Immigration Removal Centre, connecting the impact it had on him with his concurrent reading of the 20th century American poet Charles Olson. He writes, quote, that these conditions obtain that the state's virtues coil so intimately around its brutalities was a function, as Olson understood it, of political expulsion, end of quote. The third reason is to consider David Hurd's artistic practice, which is poetry, in relation to Kent University, where he is Professor of Modern Literature, as well as Kent University, which is in the historic city of Canterbury. The county of Kent is geographically the closest England gets to continental Europe and continues to be the most important point of entry by sea for visitors and migrants, including those who are seeking asylum as refugees. In the British Parliament in 2012, when she was Home Secretary, the UK former Prime Minister, Theresa May, gave a speech in which she declared, quote, the aim is to create here in Britain a really hostile environment for illegal immigrants. People horrified by these prevailing politics were forming activist groups to support and advocate for those seeking asylum who were detained indefinitely. David Hurd was part of a local group and with another group went on collaboratively to develop Refugee Tales. And these images are from Refugee Tales walks, which I'll tell you a bit more about. And I wanted to draw your attention to this one because during the walks, there are lots of moments of education, and this is one of them. Since 2015, Refugee Tales walkers have made a large-scale walk every summer in solidarity with refugees, asylum seekers, and people who have been held in immigration detention. And of course, some of those are British citizens, working in collaboration with migrants and those who have experienced the UK asylum system, and taking a great poem of journeying, the medieval poet Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, as a model. Established writers and people with lived experience of detention have shared tales in evening events. 4 volumes of tales have been published by Comma Press. Through the sharing of tales, the project has gathered and communicated experiences of migration and has sought to show the reality of indefinite detention. As the project walks, it creates a space in which the language of welcome is the prevailing discourse. About the shock of his initial encounter with Dover Immigration Removal Centre, else would have understood is that this setting was the darkest of political signs. What followed was a politically brutal decade in which personhood and the rights underpinning it were ruthlessly shut down, when expulsion became the conspicuous basis of national identity, a decade characterized by its explicit political construction in the UK of a hostile environment. It was all there in that sight, in the logic that had allowed it, in the political disregard for bare life. What was there also, therefore, was a poetic demand, a demand on the poem that it register the expulsion, the silence on which the culture had established its ground. Since its inception, since the inception of Refugee Tales, David has worked with others to develop international connections and is now involved with colleagues at Kent and other universities in developing programs and research with refugees and about the politics of migration. Some, but not all, of David's poetry carries reflections relating to migration, borders, and refugees. Because of lockdown in 2020, the Refugee Tales' usual 5-day summer walk with roughly 150 people was reduced to small groups of 6 or less. So I produced 2 postcards for people to send as a kind of compensation. They were from my 5th series of Dialogic Portraits, and for these postcards, I combined them with some of David's poetry, and they were designed by Emily Benton. I hope discussing David Hurd's work, allowing for an example from poetry but illustrated here with my pictures, gives an example of how engagement with situations unrelated to academia or to contemporary art can feed back into both, to disseminate more deeply as well as more widely, to further research and to produce very different forms and purposes in knowledge and understanding. The painted portraits you've seen here have been part of a series of dialogic portraits, some of which I included in the film I made this year from my current artist residency with the academic research project People Like You, Contemporary Figures of Personalization. Before I discuss that project, I want to introduce the concept of the Disoeuvre, and some of this may be too repetitive, and I'll skip it because of the very kind introduction that you gave me, Premjish. Before I discuss, in 2004, a moment of friction in my employment at Tate felt like a demand to reflect on consistencies of thought through different activities in my own practice. And it was from this that I developed the concept of the Disoeuvre. And just to be clear, since then, I've gradually worked on that idea, mulling it over in different forms. I went to the Getty for a bit I think it was in 2011, and did some work on it there. And then I did some more work on it when I did which I can discuss with you if you're interested in. A Disoeuvre is an artist's oeuvre that doesn't look like an oeuvre, but nevertheless is. It may contain shifts of direction, language, or discipline as an artist sustains a practice despite and in response to contingency, whether structural, political, or fluke. The concept of the Disoeuvre necessarily builds on feminist and decolonizing critiques of exclusive conventions within art to disrupt the elevated construct of the oeuvre. Those positioned as unlikely subjects to gain recognition as artists have frequently been trained to be adaptable, to work with contingency, in contrast to the consistency and discipline generated in those socially positioned for an assumed professional success. People positioned as marginal to arts production have to work socially and institutionally as well as in the studio, and here I'm repeating what Premjish has already said, in order not only to make work, but to change the structures to allow their work to be recognized and critically received as art. As a critical tool, rather than disregarding those whose conventional oeuvre seems interrupted and inconsistent, the Disoeuvre responds to practices encountering and persisting through what might be called feminized labor as maintenance or precarity, domestic instability, the transience of documentation, new recognition for overlooked visual activisms and curatorial strategies, and archival gaps, and is open to more. The Disoeuvre is a concept that relies on a collective discourse to develop meaning. I'm in the interesting position at the moment of having come up with the idea and finding other people interpreting it quite differently from me. Building on work I've done independently and with Althea Greenan, who is pictured here, curator of the Women's Art Library archive at Goldsmiths, we are now taking it further with Janice Cheddi, former executive member of the library, Alexandra Kokoli from Middlesex University, and Lena Zuverovich from Birkbeck University of London, and will present a short session at the 2022 annual conference of the Association for Art Historians. And I'm putting up the link here so that if anybody feels they want to express interest in this, please do so. I've included in my book, The Disoeuvre, a quotation from the American artist and art historian Samela Lewis, who was born in 1924. Looking back, she said, "I'm not proud of anything I did, really. I don't get proud. I just do what I have to do. And it happens, and then I go to the next thing." She continues, compiling those books about Black artists and writing the art history of African American art wasn't done for career objectives. It was a necessity. And with this additional sentence, she adds context to her career, to the quality of her oeuvre. David Hurd's demand on the poem, or maybe the question of desire, echoes this. And I guess so too do my moments of friction. It was also a moment of friction that enabled me to develop the sort of, if you like, the method of dialogic portraits. I also quoted from, in the book, I also quoted from curator Naima J. Keith in the Disoeuvre, who had written, and I'm quoting, "Dr. Samela S. Lewis is a visual artist and pioneer in the field of art history. In 1969, she became education coordinator at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, an opportunity she pursued because she wanted to create new exhibition opportunities for African American artists. She fought vigorously for the hiring of more African Americans by the museum, but after more than a year of constant conflict and disappointment, she resigned," end of quote. I first came across Lewis in the 2011 exhibition, Now Dig This, Art and Black Los Angeles, 1960 to 1980, at the Hammer Museum in Los Angeles. Beside one of her works was a note that Lewis had worked in gallery education in the 1970s. I have written about British gallery education's early development in the 1980s elsewhere, when artists were creating spaces for experimentation for alternative and frequently radical curatorial models. While I was head of interpretation and education at Tate Britain in the 2000s, I recognized that a project I led with people in 3 cities, London, Damascus, and Amman, was a part of my continuing artistic practice, distinct from other work that I undertook as an employee. This project led directly to a film I later made independently with a former Syrian colleague who's still based in Damascus, continuing a development of our work together. However, I want here to pick up on Naima Keith's final sentence that after more than a year of constant conflict and disappointment, Samela Lewis resigned. A fundamental concept in picturing a conventional oeuvre is the consistency associated with linear progress. However, if one confronts constant conflict and disappointment that is structured into institutional and social relations, one is indeed likely sometimes to resign. My work with Refugee Tales has informed my approach to the major research project I was invited to contribute to, People Like You, Contemporary Figures of Personalization. And I want to just say here that just add a point which may be interesting to you, which is that when the conversations for this project first started, it was really between two sociologists, one an anthropologist, one a sociologist. And they developed the project together, talking to me and talking to a poet as well. And then ultimately, in order to, I think this is fair to say, that in order to extend the research and make funding possibilities greater, they extended the work that we were doing from research into one aspect of it was people with using hospices who had cancer, and they extended that to do more work around medicine and the use of medical data. And obviously that opened up greater chances of funding, which they did receive. And of course, it was also particularly pertinent because it was because COVID happened. It is a cross-disciplinary research project produced by a group of scientists, sociologists, anthropologists, and artists. We have different roles and pursue different aspects of what personalization might mean. As well as researchers and artists, the group's work is dependent on and enhanced by a brilliant administrator, who I personally think is absolutely critical to the whole thing. When she introduced a panel at last week's conference for this project, Professor Celia Lurie, the principal investigator working on digital cultures, with whom I've worked most closely, stated that this project, quote, explores practices of personalization in health, data science, and digital culture. Our aim is to try to understand what personalization means, how, while appearing to be only about individuals, it includes a wide variety of processes that connect and cut across the economy, culture, politics, and everyday life. This is an image from the website, referring to key statements from the late 1980s by Prime Minister Thatcher and by a senior advisor to the later Prime Minister Blair. Celia Lurie stated, quote, in between then and now, the distinction between consumer and citizen has become blurred. We have also witnessed what could not have been anticipated in the 1980s, the rise of the internet, the emergence of what has been called a participatory condition, in which digital participation is normative and environmental, and the rise of big data, algorithmic governance, and machine learning. But this does not mean that the difficulties in thinking about relations between individuals and collectives has gone away. Our project is looking at how personalization connects the individual and collectives of various kinds. In particular, it is looking at what happens when the you of people like you who like things like this is simultaneously singular and plural. This is my sixth series of dialogic portraits and the first with an academic research project. Ultimately, my role was defined as artist in residence within the research project, alongside a poet and a graphic designer, although initially it wasn't as clearly stated as this. With dialogic portraits, I work with watercolor portraits in disregard of art's fashions, acknowledging the associations in British cultural life of both amateurism and gender imbued in the material and the form. The process I've developed is to make a minimum of 2 watercolor portraits of each sitter, usually taking 2 days. During the sitting, we talk, and over time, the talking has taken on different roles. For this series, I'd already become interested not just in the conversation, but also in how a sitter's face and body move as they talk. The portrait is made entirely in the studio with the sitter, and so the picture is both a portrait and a document of time spent together. In this sense, the watercolor has the potential to resemble duration, comparable with the real time of film. By incorporating the sitter's signature alongside mine, I symbolically acknowledge the sitter's labor. At some point, Following the sittings, I make a recorded discussion with the sitter, and much later, I'll extract recorded sentences to create a script of mixed dialogue for perhaps a book, or in this case, a film. I started making dialogic portraits just over a decade ago. I have consciously drawn on my experience of parenting, of institutional management roles, and of diary writing. Working with people like you extended my thinking from the power relations imbued in the individual gaze of a privileged artist to connect this to the intransigent and godlike oversight industrialized as surveillance. The conversations form a trail of thought between one sitter and the next, often informing the development of the paintings and the project. As well as the subject of personalization, in research project meetings, questions were raised about proxies, figures, series, sequence, multiplicity, lineage, physical displacement, bodily archives, and these discussions affected who I chose to invite to sit for me. I included people who were at the time classed as illegal immigrants, while also inviting a poet who happens to have a baronetcy, which is a form of, it's a, what do you call it, an honor in the British system of privileges, basically, passed down since the 17th century through the oldest males in his family. This led me to see portraiture as a material form of lineage, also accumulated and passed down through generations. Mobility and stability, which identify us as figures and as series, are not identified only by the face, but products associated with the face reveal our personalized status. In this project, I've often thought of the brushstroke as a form of data which builds a picture of a person. So what type of brushstroke most resembles data, and whose data is it, the sitter's or mine? In Western modernism, the hand of the artist is seen as expressive, the gestural mark the expression. A sitter once said, seeing the portrait series that she was a part of, that she felt she'd joined a family of portraits because of the shared look of them. Throughout this series, I've been thinking about the face as a common site both for portraiture and digital innovations, whether as selfies for social media or facial recognition as a form of policing. I had expected to explore this in recorded discussions with sitters to contribute to the film I plan to make. I'm affected by what I've read while working reflexively from practice rather than producing work as a direct result of academic study. I'm also working with and affected by the atmosphere and physical elements around me, most obviously the quality of daylight at the time of painting. Again, I'm affected by geopolitical conditions. When I was making preparatory work for the film, a regular leading item on television news concerned the demonstrations for human rights in Hong Kong. The face took on an increasingly symbolic role in relation to human rights as masks to counter facial recognition surveillance made visually explicit the challenge of the demonstrators, countered by the laws making masks illegal. Gradually, the leading news crossed from Hong Kong to China's pandemic, and as the virus traveled, the face, the vulnerability of its openings to transmit and receive the virus, and its relation to masks also became news. Because it was such a focus of news, I felt the face itself, whether masked or unmasked, became too topical to become an explicit issue in the film. In making the film, I've tried to unsettle representation and defining the other, apparently made easy by cameras and television. Reproducing voices, I think of poetry's use of composite spoken phrases rather than television's vox pop. Scott Walk, one of my colleagues in People Like You, picked up on someone in the film saying, "It's a piece of work trying to be a person," equating this with the sense of intentional inadequacy inherent in the portraits in the film. The pandemic clarified for me the initial tendency for politicians to speak with certainty about data as a form of prediction. It led me to think that the failures to adequately represent through portraiture may possibly be analogous with the failures to adequately predict through data. The film is set at a former hoverport on the Kent coast, partly to indicate that technologies do come and go. However, I'm concerned that perhaps data, algorithms, and digital technologies frustrate but don't offer the physical or argumentative moments of friction that produce creative, tangible creative responses, like, for instance, my moments of friction or David Hurd's encounter with the building that was Dover Immigration Removal Centre. If we've got time, I'd love to show you just about 3 minutes of the film. Do we have time?
Yes,
Yes,
please.
yes, please carry on. Yeah, yeah.
Okay, I'll just make that link.
Class.
Sorry.
When I was a kid, we were branded at that time as kind of illegal, and that's why they're demolishing our houses. Refugees is not genetic, you know. And it's true, no human is illegal. And you can have that brand. I mean, I had it because of my tribes and because of the color of my skin. We're not the cause of injustice. We're born into it.
What we need in the border force is data.
It's not in the camps.
We've got a very good targeting centre in this country.
And it's in the prisons.
Obviously, additional data will come in.
It's not in the prisons.
Good intelligence, data sharing platforms.
That's somewhere else we can't even identify.
When people think about you as data, they kind of think that it's the data outside of the person. And so it becomes depersonalized.
No one is an average.
This wave of data that somehow represents everything about humans. Well, there's a kind of beauty in that. But then you think about, well, who's got this data and do you trust them?
The internet in general is energy consuming. The more images, the less valuable they are. We are definitely losing a lot of visceral connection with those images. The amount of videos being stored and data being stored is quite mad.
At the end of that technology is a human being.
So this very famous image with the overseer, the landscape of the Caribbean is produced in some ways that at all times the overseer can see the enslaved activity.
We developed a kind of sense of Flick's facial repertoire, and there's a fairly clear sense for when the painting was going well in her opinion and when it wasn't going so well in her opinion.
So did you get comments along the way? Because I had Flick could comment, and at one point she said, "Oh, I'm making you look like John Prescott." That was not the one that I remember thinking.
Really?
No, yeah.
Right, can I find you again now? Yes, here we are. how to stop sharing. There we are. Thank you. Hello? Is anybody there? There we are.
Yes, everyone.
Good.
I think you will have to stop the screen sharing. I request you to.
Oh, I thought I'd just done that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Has it worked?
Yeah, yes, it's worked. It's worked.
Okay. Good. Good.
Thank you. Thank you, Felicity, for that poignant, moving monologue, delivered with extreme sensitivity, and also providing us concepts for utopic futurities, is how I see it. And I'm also very, very interested in, and I think the audience also, in the concept of disoeuvre, the neologism you have formulated as an alternative to conventional, the term oeuvre, referring to the arts heroes and their works, and the what you call the mystification associated with it. Whereas you are foregrounding the unrecognized work, and you are foregrounding the work that is not recognized, that exists in between, or that exists in the domestic, or that does not exist in the studio. And that is something very fascinating and important. I was, before like inviting you, I was reading the article called Eurasia, Transformation and the Politics of Pedagogy, which makes, and also now when I listen to you, I was thinking that artistic research could be again reconfigured. And for this, I also take inspiration from Ida Baird. What she said, artist is somebody who makes the other an artist, or who provides the resources for the other to become an artist. And when I listen to you, when I read your article, I feel that artistic research is also about researching on and through other artists, by collaborating with them, by excavating the practices that are located in the margins, curating their works, writing about them, theorizing their practices. And I think this is also an important artistic research which does not, or which will not fall into the bureaucratic university idea of artistic research. So I wanted to start with this particular area of artistic research, which you are involved in.
I think that's really interesting what you're saying, because one of the things that I was so struck by in the short article that I read by David Hurd about the moment of where the poem demanded, was when he encountered this terrible building. But the point he makes is it happened that at the same time, or maybe it provoked him, I'm not quite sure, to read Charles Olson differently from how he had read him before. So previously he hadn't been that interested in him. But what he found was that Charles Olson was talking about silences and was actually doing a lot of research into American politics at the time to uncover and make that discussion about silences. And I was really struck by how it's more than one thing that one is working with. One is working with the shock of a building, the shock of what's happening in a building, but also with finding, not just those, artists or poets or whoever who've always been important to you, but suddenly something happens and you get a new interest, a new insight from another writer, and one is in conversation. And one of the things that I know not everybody feels this, but when I was working at Tate, because I was trained as a painter, I worked at Tate for 6 years. And when I was working there, I was actually very grateful that most contemporary exhibitions were not of painting, we had a Peter Doig show or something when I was there, but not many other major contemporary painting shows. And the reason I was grateful that they weren't on show was because every time I see, not every time, but often when I see contemporary artists' paintings, it just makes me want to paint. That is my reaction, you know. And so I was kind of relieved not to have to be confronted with that reaction too often. And I think that there is that sense that there are loads. I mean, I've just joined a WhatsApp group that goes swimming in the sea that you saw in the film. Freezing cold, okay, freezing cold sea. And all these people have moved down to this particular area. It's a very poor area on the east coast of Britain. And all these people have moved down here. They're mostly women. They're sort of my age or a bit younger. And they have not got much money, which is why they've moved here. But now they're going swimming all the time. And they've taken early retirement from teaching in schools so that they can become ceramicists or so that they can become artists of one sort or another. Because a lot of people want to make things.
Interesting. Thank you for that. And one more point, before I enter into this question, to the audience, please feel free to type into the chat box. Please, any comments, any questions you have for Dr. Allen, please enter your responses in the chat box. Also, I wanted to touch upon a very strong argument in your practice and in your writings, which is a critique of the conventional research and education that caters to the production of the nation state and its culture, which you have also written about. And you have strongly argued that the education and research, it reinforces particular conditions that produces particular forms of education. And this is why we need to reconfigure education. We need to reconfigure artistic research so that we don't fall into the trap of reproducing the nation state and its culture. And how do you think the gallery education you are talking about, the infiltration of museums you are talking about, have provided an antidote to this sort of education and research?
I think it just does it in very small amounts. It's not a large scale thing, so you don't do mass change. For instance, when I was at Tate, there would be enormous numbers of school children coming regularly to have, get a session, a workshop in the gallery. For me, that was not so interesting, although it could be. But what we were able to do was to work with small groups of mainly teenagers outside of school. We found that working with secondary schools was a real problem, but working with young people outside of school meant that they could, there was a much greater freedom. One of the things that I grew up with, because I grew up in the period of social democracy, let's say, was the idea that these institutions, these what we call public institutions, were ours, that they belong to us. Young people growing up now do not have that sense at all because they've become consumers. And so it's a very different experience. So one of the things that it felt very important to me was to keep on saying, this is your place. And if you want to, you can get involved. And what I found happen, and this, for me, this was really interesting. We were working, okay, so at Tate Britain, because it had recently taken on the name Britain, it became particularly important that we had a decolonizing approach to this in a way that was more radical, I would argue, than what Tate Modern was doing at the same time. and also we didn't have the kind of marketing sort of fanfare, so we could just get on and be quietly getting on with stuff. It meant that we were working with state schools, inner city state schools, and largely inner city state schools are filled with working class, mostly Black and Asian young people, people from a migrant heritage, let's say. And for a lot of them, they were the first members of their family to go anywhere near an art museum, anywhere near the idea of doing higher education. One of the things that became clear to me as we were working with these young people was the ways in which some of them would become increasingly connected to the museum. And I realized that actually, because they were largely going off to do fine art degree, not all of them, but some of them were choosing to go off and do fine art degrees, actually, ultimately, they would become curators in the future. So this is a completely different cohort of potential curators than the normal Courtauld graduates who have been running Tate until now. And I found that once I left Tate, I started to go and be invited to give lectures and so on in various institutions. And I kept on finding these people coming up, well, smiling at me, actually. They would sit there smiling at me, and I'd think, who is this smiling at me? And it would be someone who'd passed through and was now doing a curatorial program or whatever it was from those Tate groups. So that's just a tiny example. But for me, it was a really important kind of tangible example of the way, actually, if they get jobs in Tate, and we made sure, I mean, basically, one of my aims when I got to Tate was to change the color of the department, and largely we did have an impact there, you know, and that was a really important part of my work. And therefore, it's a small thing, but there will be other places doing similar work around the place. And because of the lack of interest in what we were doing, we were able to be quite radical, I think.
Atul?
Thank you, Felicity and Dr. Allen. A wonderful presentation, and it really moved me. But I don't have a question, but I just have a few comments. What comes to my mind is when you with the phrase "the silence on which the culture had established its ground," and the poems, and somehow Anna Akhmatova comes to my mind. And
Sorry, I didn't hear.
Anna Akhmatova comes to
Oh,
my
yeah.
mind,
Oh, really?
and her waiting outside the Kremlin walls after I think Stalin had taken away her son and her husband, and her continuous waiting outside the walls. It just kind of, I mean, I just see that similarity, always coming to me, if people who are detained indefinitely and people who are waiting, wherever they're waiting around the world to hear some news of them. I mean, it's almost a similar situation. And then somebody in the line asking Akhmatova that, would you be able to describe this? It's like asking a poet whether to bear witness. And I would like to come here. I don't know whether I can, but it's like artistic research here, what you do, as the artistic research here becomes, is as witness. you know, it's the research turns into what you witness, and I think that's an important part to bring in to institutions and this thing as the artist itself bearing witness
It's
to.
very interesting you say that, because when I was younger, I would have been horrified at that idea. And I now feel perfectly comfortable with it. And I also think, I mean, I think for me, I've got clearer and clearer about my relation to realism. And I mean, a number of artists for a long time have been saying that they want to show things in a way that's distinct from the news, because the news is so impoverished. And when you mentioned Akhmatova, I immediately connected with something I'd been thinking about the other day, which is, I don't know whether you know it, but there's a poem by Marina Tsvetaeva, which is called Readers of Newspapers. And oh, you must have a look at it. It's very funny, but it's and it's very biting. And what I realized was that the addiction that I and many of us have to our screens, to our mobiles, is absolutely, I want Marina Tsvetaeva to be challenging me as a reader of newspaper in the same way. It's that kind of addiction, which means that you don't bear witness, that you are distracted, that you are seduced into all sorts of corporate games that are nothing to do with, well, that separate you. And this is the point that, in a way, I have never been that interested in sort of data science, let's say, until now. Going through the pandemic, it became, and while I was working with the people like you, project, meant that I kind of felt like there was a manifestation of what data science does and how it gets used in really quite horrific ways as a predictive force, which actually is completely about categorizing and controlling and distinguishing one group from another. And for me, that how to engage with that, which is so abstract, how to engage with that is a challenge, I think.
Yeah, thank you.
There are two comments. There are two comments, and I will read them jointly, and then if you would like to respond to them, you could do that, and then we could ask Atul to conclude the session, as we are also getting late now.
Yeah.
Professor Indrapramit Roy says, thoroughly enjoyed the session, and if I may say, the very sensitive portraits even more. Perfectly understand the relief at not having too many painting exhibitions at Tate so as not to miss painting. In some ways, that frames the dilemma. Artists doing research as part of their quest, and artists being pushed into research with a gun at their head as the only option of career advancement within the academy.
Yeah. I think.
Yeah, if you respond, please.
Well, I just wanted to say, I think that's absolutely right. And I completely sympathize with you. And I mean, some of us have made, I mean, I was trained as a child in movement. I moved all the time from one place to another. And so I have thrown in the towel at various points when things have become too difficult within institutions in a way that has not been particularly productive for me in terms of, you know, status or whatever, or consistency, let's say. But I really sympathize with people who are stuck trying to make things work in academic institutions, which are really becoming more and more alienating. And the only thing that, I mean, earlier today, someone was saying, I think it was Jonathan Harris was saying, we need to connect globally as people teaching in academies. And I do think that that is something that I can recommend, because there has to be global resistance to the politics, the prevailing politics. Otherwise, we're doomed, I think.
Thank you. The second comment is by Shefali Jain, who was also one of the speakers today. Thank you, Professor Allen, for bringing up the idea of Disoeuvre. Alongside teaching at a university, I have been part of creating 2 collectives with friends, precisely because the standardized and increasingly capitalist spaces of the institution, whether the university or the gallery space, expect a uniform oeuvre, whereas any kind of questioning or resistance to status quo would necessarily involve a rethinking or rather a breakdown of the idea of the oeuvre. In fact, even though the university where I teach in its early years let us design courses that critique the notion of oeuvre, it has gradually and consistently made it so hard to sustain these meaningfully that one wonders if it is worth the struggle to fight for making such spaces inside of the institution.
Yeah. I think that's it's really tough. I mean, it used to be the case when I stopped teaching in higher education, I regretted it because I missed out on the long summer breaks, which was a problem as a mother, not having them. But now, my husband teaches at a university, and they've now done this fantastic thing, which is completely George Orwell, which is to change the numbers of the weeks. So the first week is now week 9. So that means the whole of the summer has gone. You no longer have the summer break in anything like the way that we would have thought of it when I was teaching in universities. So when things like that happen, when people start changing the numbers of weeks, I mean, really, the madness is so great that you have to be careful of your mental health.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Allen. Thank you for this wonderful lecture. Very inspiring. And look forward for more interactions with you and also to collaborate in any forms and for more interaction, for more learnings together. Thank you for joining us today.
Can I thank you so much for inviting me? And it's been such a privilege. And I'm amazed that I've got plus 38 people still here. I'm really impressed. And thank you all for hanging on. Thank you.
Now I invite Atul to give the concluding remarks and the vote of thanks. But I also want to thank Atul for convening the committee and also to kind of organizing this conference, which is very relevant for our times. Thank you, Atul, for doing this.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Facility. Thank you, Premjish, for your comments. And thank you, everyone, for being here, number one. I must first thank, I must do my thank yous first, and then I can comment on what we're going on. Because I would first like to thank Swati Singh, who has been the administrative assistant at the department, who's been running the show behind the scenes. Thank you, Swati, so much for all your time, effort, and correcting so many mistakes that we have been doing through technology or otherwise. Thank you so much. I'd like to thank you, Ajay Bahel. Thank you, Veer Chandra, as well, and the department, Sumantro, Vasudha, Sharmila, Adya, Meghna, Premjish, and Gigi. Without your help and feedback, this should not. Well, I could not have done, or we could not have managed this. And also the students who've been attending these sessions quite a bit. Right? And then coming back to what we started off to do is research and knowledge production in arts practices, and this was the second section in art practice. And what comes to mind is the Trojan horse that came up in a number of conversation of the artistic research taking the form of a Trojan horse, whether whether visible or invisible, to be kind of pushed into the academic or institutional arena. Otherwise, I mean, that is the only way that we can include all that we talked of, right? Whether it be this, it be uh, intellectual constellations, the ephemeral forms of, the to discover interdisciplinarity through ephemeral forms, the archival forms, the iterants between institutional spaces, right? Well, like from Jivesh's talk, and how the visceral can hold immensity, the intimate knowledge in doubt, and also Premji's thing of desire, the desire against academic rationality, uh, and research being one of the dirtiest words. And how do we kind of overcome that as artists? And and the fact that somehow it was mentioned in some documents, I think the Vienna Declaration that artistic research has a very short history, and that has was challenged also by Vidya, bringing up the archive of Jyoti Bhatt as well as Meenakshi Mukherjee, and what is not seen, but the amount that we artists accumulate in our studios, in our minds, and to not recognize that as part of a body of the foundation of research that we kind of do. Also, thank you, Jonathan, also to bringing in how British or their institutions function, and that the institutionalizing doesn't guarantee anything. I totally agree with Jonathan there, but definitely we must push the boundaries wherever we are, and to come towards a certain notion of desire to kind of uh, you know continue with what we artists actually do, right? Initially, when I started talking at the beginning of is not a work of art an intellectual proposition, and Prem's comment on after that was how to tame the artist. We don't think we need to be tamed, because then the curators and art historians would also be tamed, right? Right. But but I think that we should being in institutions, and with the help of artists and academics who are outside institutions, and who are who call themselves post-institution people, we can still make somewhere. I think we can still make a huge difference, right? Because it's like what somebody said, that I think Danny, but the institutions don't know how to use the knowledge that they have, right? And make them recognize that this is just under their nose, and then we exist, because the arts is something, especially within the South Asian, especially in the Indian context, we are the periphery. Only when somebody sells a work for a huge amount of money do we make news. Otherwise, we don't make any news whatsoever, right? So we are there, and that they should be able to use us in terms of, not that our research is only utilitarian, but definitely as something that we exist, and that they will have to definitely deal with us. Right. I would like to end at that note. Thank you all for being with us. We shall soon put all of the keynotes online. They have been recorded. Let's do that with their permissions, of course. And thank you so much for being with us. Thank you. Wonderful 2 days. And I don't think I've done justice, but I have to definitely thank all the speakers: Felicity Allen, Danny Butt, Alan D'Souza, Jivesh Bakchi, Shifali Jain, Premjish, Indra Promitre, and I don't know whether Akia Anzi, Jonathan, Jibesh, James Elkins, Munis Ahmed Shah, I forgot, Vidya Shivdas, everybody else. Forgive me if I'm forgetting any names, but definitely a big thank you. And we'll be in touch with you for more, some of these sessions, maybe one-on-one with our students, or maybe one with you. with the university. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
Bye. Bye.